Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be able to be here at the end of 6 months' work and present to you the project in relation to our client, which is UEFA Events SA. UEFA Events SA has two divisions, marketing and operations. And under the operations sections falls the topic with which we're going to speak to you about today. I want to say that 6 months ago began a project that we had only one question, and we had very little idea of accreditation. We now stand 6 months later and have many more questions, but we know a lot more about accreditation. What we can say to you is it's an extraordinarily complex and diverse field of knowledge. If we look at UEFA's interests in the Euros, to paint you the scene, we have 54 member associations that feed into 24 finalists over some 3-week competition, 8 cities in Poland, Ukraine, over 95,000 accreditation passes or registrants processed and issued, not to mention the ones that are declined. So on one side we have all the 10 target groups using the system. UEFA in the middle with its system, intranet system, you'll hear us refer to the system FAME, F-A-M-E, that's the Football Administration and Management Environment of UEFA, that manages those target groups and users with then their approval or decline of accreditations. And the other thing is that then this system has to make sense in diverse venues throughout the continent of Europe. Let's begin by understanding the presentation. Essentially the roadmap is here as you see it. We're going to first of all define what is accreditation, then look at our methodology through primary and secondary data that after Hôtelière will take you through. We'll look at how we evaluated the data, our proposals, and then what we believe are some solutions. What is accreditation? You might say, simply put, it's the access right to carry out a function. It is not a ticket. It is the allowance to carry out a function or a duty of work for the right person in the right place at the right time. Now, within this project, we were clear about our objectives after an extensive debrief with Ms. Maika Hartmann, who couldn't join us today, as you're aware. And what we can say is that based on our understanding, the current accreditation practice of UEFA manages, as we mentioned, complexity, time, and data. So there is a countdown to the registration, encryption of data into UEFA's system, and issuance of accreditation devices that starts well before the event. That lasts right up until match day and kick-off. Why this? We were operating in a highly technological field. We had to operate on the basis of seeking and understanding, not seeking and destroying, but seeking and understanding, and it was a little bit stealth-like in that we were under an NDA to maintain confidentiality in all our approaches. This has implications for some of the costings that we could or could not attain, as you'll be aware of in the report. So our objectives then came down to identifying, painting the picture of what is out there in accreditation. Like a painter's palette with all the colours on there, what do people take to paint or construct their accreditation system? And it's all diverse. The other thing that is important about our objectives is that we needed to identify for UEFA what is not only being commonly used, but what could benchmark best practice. And then what are the emerging trends in the technologies and practices that could be used. What this then led us on to understand is the scope of our project. On our radar screen was not VIP ticketing, guest management services, or the rebuild, if you like, of FAME. That's an IT structure that is beyond our scope of competence and also time and resources. So we were looking at both, in terms of scope, sport and non-sport organisations. And for UEFA, they were particularly interested in what do non-sport organisations do? Is there something that could be learned or employed in process or technology? And this is what we decided that we need to answer. So the topic of our discussion clearly is best practices and new trends. What's on the horizon? What is emerging? What may there be out there in terms of processes and materials, in terms of practices and systems that would lead us to make recommendations based not on some quixotic idealistic idea, but on feasibility, technology now that can be, in a detailed project plan, costed, financed, and made operational within a time guidelines. What I'd like to do now is to hand over to the next stage of the presentation, whereafter I will take you through our methodology in relation to our discussion theme.
Thanks, Ezio. So our methodology was basically revolved around how we would benchmark our best practices and identify new trends. This basically we had two methods of data collection, secondary and primary. Secondary data was mainly literature, which there's not much published literature on this topic, as not many people like to share how they carry out accreditation because it's usually to do with security. We had websites and supplier documentation. And as you can also see, our primary data, where we got a lot of our information from, was semi-structured interviews, a site visit to Juventus Stadium during the Europa League final in Torino, the Juventus Stadium, and industry consultation. We basically formulated metrics to benchmark all these, to benchmark accreditation practices based on the industry research. For example, the use of RFIDs at the Sochi Winter Olympics, as well as the use of RFIDs in accreditations by UEFA at the 2012 Euro. We created a scoring matrix to divide. We created this scoring matrix to divide the data we had into two sections, which is 17 metrics for accreditation practices and 4 for new trends. We spoke to a total of 23, we got information from a total of 23 organizations, both sporting and non-sporting organizations. We had 12 non-sporting organizations and 11 sporting organizations. So here you can see a list of all the common practices that between sporting and non-sporting organizations. And we realized that some of the most common ones were the use of zoning to divide a venue, and then using numbers and colors to mark the accreditations with, steward training, accreditation assistant training, and as well as the use of paper posters and manual checkpoints were the most common practices among all sporting and non-sporting organizations. Now, for the analysis, I'd like to hand it over back to Ezio.
From this raw data that came from primary and secondary sources, we were left with a lot of information. The question was, how do we classify it and codify it so that it helps us make some sense and meaning to this? So this is where, from the documentation, our semi-structured interviews, the data was classified. We constructed a matrix sheet of all these different organizations against these different 17 metrics, and we tallied the frequency with which these practices were adopted or deployed. You will have noticed as well here that green is an absolute go, they use it. Red, they do not use it, and yellow, they are considering to use it. So there was a little bit greater depth or richness to the information because it was a semi-structured interview, so we were enabled to ask further questions. This is important in our analysis when we come to identifying from the common practices. This gave us a frequency of what's common, what is everyone using? We tallied that, but that didn't tell us what's best, not yet. And that was the next step, then how to identify the trends and best practices to come to our findings. So what we did with the information that was gathered in this frequency score, along with the semi-structured interview which specifically asked questions in relation to the personal preferences of those responsible for accreditation. And we should say that accreditation is not always under an accreditation manager. In our methodology and analysis, part of the great challenge was to identify who to talk to and approach these organizations, particularly some of the non-sport organizations which are very confidential in their practices, such as SAM, the UN, and the WEF, which is the World Economic Forum. Best practice is contextually specific. What is best practice in accreditation is not necessarily so in auto manufacturing, in medicine, or in law. But in relation to performance and effectiveness of accreditation practices, after surveying the literature, we found that these dimensions of affordability, reliability, efficiency and simplicity were key. UEFA is very sensitive to simplicity, reliability, efficiency, and costs. The accreditation market is a mature market. All the suppliers have many common technologies that are used by most people that we contacted, and secondly, it's very cost sensitive because everything about accreditation is an investment. So far, everything that a federation does by supplying accreditation costs them money and they get nothing back. So therefore it's sensitive. So here's an example of how we use the common practices, the semi-structured interview preferences that the respondents indicated in their comments, in relation to two examples being mapped in this compass, manual checkpoint and biometrics. So if you simply follow manual checkpoint, relatively simple, very affordable, possibly reliable, moderately, that depends on the level of training and compliance of the individual checking at that point, as our discussions with people in Torino it alerted us to. And of course, it's reasonably efficient. By comparison, biometrics, which is the taking of a physical trait, measuring it, codifying it or encrypting it, and putting it somewhere where it can then be accessed to authenticate and give access rights through acceptance or denial. Biometrics is highly efficient, it's extremely reliable, there's a cost. It's relatively simple once you understand the system. So for all these different metrics with the semi-structured interviews aligned to preferences, it gave us an indication of best practices in accreditations. Sport organisations and non-sport organisations employ manual checkpoints, steward or assistant training, use of paper posters or cardboard, and zoning, numbers and colours, sometimes with alphabets. These are the practices that benchmark what is best, preferred, and the right balance between cost, efficiency, reliability and simplicity on that dimensional compass of effective performance. What new trends emerge from, the new trends, we should say, emerge not from sport organisations, but from non-sport organisations. This is probably not surprising in relation to the significant volunteer nature that impacts on sporting federations as opposed to non-sport organisations. The main trends emerging can be categorised as biometrics, graphene, tablets, and screens. Screen technology. Tablets are BYO, bring your own devices, and the proliferation of these into wearable devices. Graphene is basically lead pencil. It's carbon. It's one atom thick, the strongest, most abundant and lightest material known to man. It is now, as we speak, being commercialised in mass production, but in time-wise, you'll note in our report we don't specifically include it as the recommendation, only because of the length of time. It will come, but we believe it will be around 2015 as opposed to 5 years' time. 2020, as opposed to a shorter time. The recommendations, essentially, the main finding, the takeaway message, is that accreditation's future is automation and technology dependent. Here's something to think about. When we speak about automation, a lot of the feedback we got from respondents had to do with the fact that they would like to see automation. How would you build that into an accreditation system? Think of the model of first-class travel. You go into the airline, the airport or the airline has your data in a system. That data is accessed by you either online pre-check-in. You go to the airport counter. You are not served necessarily now by a human, good or bad. There is a check-in kiosk. Could that check-in kiosk be used in accreditation? How much do they cost? Good question. We couldn't find that answer out because no one publishes the cost of these units. But this is something we'll refer to in our recommendations a little bit further on. But it's a very interesting model because the dynamic of check-in and crowd management and flow through airport terminals and airport check-in is not dissimilar to the mass crowd management and accreditation that UEFA faces in its venues. So, the recommendations in relation to UEFA's needs This is a vein ID biometric device. The OLAE, I'm sure if you've read the report now, you are very familiar with that expression. It stands for Organic Large Area Electronic Displays and Printed Electronics. Forget the word electronics. If you think about printing, using ink to put something on a paper or substrate. Think electronic, what if that ink were metallic? Then the lines, the dots and everything actually become circuitry that you build. This has implication, printed electronics, on these kinds of surfaces, or paper even, for reducing, driving down costs. Example, UEFA currently spend close to €1 full on an RFID chip that they introduced in their 2012 Euro accreditation passes. The cost of printing electronically an RFID, we know now, it is in the literature, is a few cents. There is some very interesting potential. The next thing that was flagged is a greater depth of steward training in our findings and recommendation. The other thing is this expression here. I'm sure, again, if you've read the report, you will be aware that the IoT is the Internet of Things and cloud. Now, let me say this first. When you probably think of cloud now, you think of what happened with Apple some week ago. Yes, and these pictures of these celebrities that got downloaded and pillaged. This is not Apple Cloud. There are basically three types of cloud. Hybrid, public and private. For UEFA's needs that need 100% ownership of their data at every point in the accreditation system, from FAME to the end user, security of data is critical. There is now, the US government is now using cloud technology to actually upload its data on individuals and secure information. And that's included in your USB stick, Wolfram, as an interesting article for you to look at. The Internet of Things refers to things, these, anything, accreditation devices that people wear, and any device that can transmit a signal connected with the environment. It already exists, it's part of the way you use your RFID tag to go through the freeway, yes? And it beeps. Imagine that everywhere, or in an environment. That's what the Internet of Things are. These are the things that sense and track. So that's why it's very interesting for logistics. And basically accreditation is the logistics of people for their function at the right time. Biometrics enable fast, secure authentication. This is an example of how the vein ID integration into the FAME system may occur. Through the reader that you saw illustrated, it takes the vein ID, and later in our discussion we can elaborate on why we are suggesting perhaps vein and not facial ID, such as Colosseo use, which is a event supplier, venue supplier based in, I think it's Slovenia if I'm not mistaken. It reduces errors in application, and it's used in airports and organisations that require high-level security. It's non-forgettable, non-transferable. At the end, you get an authentication or not. This is an illustration of one of these devices in a dock where it can be updated with data. The application is to replace devices, personal ID, and here as a poster at a bus terminal in Dresden, in Germany. Printable electronics, or RFIDs. This was shown at a printed electronics show in Europe this year by the same company that does these screens. And as we spoke, the integration of things with sensors through a cloud communication, that would be in venue. In relation to steward training, we'll briefly hand over to Aftab, who'll finish up with.
Thanks, Atul. So steward training, what does UEFA currently do for steward training? On match day, basically all the stewards are at the venue. There are two categories. There are head stewards and the ones with not much experience. So the head stewards are usually briefed by UEFA staff and then disseminate the information to all the other stewards in groups of 12 to 15. So what we've suggested is a blending learning program. As you can see, it's basically, the first module is divided into two. Depending on a city which has access to Wi-Fi for the stewards and or laptops, and a city which there is no access to Wi-Fi and or laptops. The main thing is to send them or show them a video tutorial which basically briefs all the stewards, whether head or a beginner, on all the aspects that they're going to face when they, especially with accreditation, as UEFA's system is pretty complicated, and if they are learning it just on match day through a briefing, it can be pretty tough for them to understand. Mainly, the main thing is to use this video tutorial dubbed in the local language of whichever UEFA country out of the 54 they're having the event in, and eventually keep track of these stewards as the process continues, so that they can know which ones have how much experience. The second module would be training those same stewards that they have already trained and give them more experience through a similar program, and again make sure that they understand the entire process perfectly. It's also, they should have assessments after they're given this video tutorial to make sure they understand everything. I'll just hand it over to Ezio again to just wrap it up.
In conclusion, this is the situation among sports organisations. UEFA is there at best at the practice level. The problem is it's complex and it's not easily understood. If it's not easily understood, it's difficult to teach. And you need to understand it to improve it. The solution is more technology to address their requirements. These are our roadmap proposals, and at that point, we think it's an excellent time to stop and let you take that in and frame the questions, which we'd be happy to handle.